studied this for a long time, and they concluded that there were ways of thinking that seemed to result in people not getting their needs met, and ways of thinking that did. So there are better or worse ways of thinking about things. But you do have to take the individual in their cultural, familial, religious, ethnic, whatever it is, context to appreciate how they might think about different ways of thinking. So, for example, you might feel very confident in saying, oh, perfectionism is bad. Why would you want to be a perfectionist? It's not good for you. It's unhealthy. But a lot of cultures, in particularly historically oppressed minority cultures, have had this experience that if you're not very careful to be seen as perfect by the dominant culture at the time, they get hurt, or their loved ones get hurt. And so telling someone to just chill out and be less of a perfectionist might not land the same way for every person, because being perfect or being seen as perfect might have certain implications in their culture. Another example is all or nothing thinking, right? If you're working with, let's say, an Orthodox Jewish individual, you can't say, like, it doesn't really matter if the tefillah goes to the center of your head. Anywhere on your head would be fine, right? You can't do that. There are reasons why the culture is sort of oriented around certain behaviors, and those rituals are mandated, and you've either done them or you haven't done them. And so you have to be more creative than saying, well, can you just sort of half do them? Because the answer might be no. And so then you have to look at, well, what is the amount of time and attention you should be giving to making sure that you're doing it the right way? Because I want you to do it the right way and not the wrong way. We also don't want the effort you're putting into doing it the right way to keep you from being able to do it at all, because you got to do it because that's what your religion tells you. And rigid rules for responding to thoughts and emotions. If you've ever worked with somebody on the autism spectrum, simply telling them to accept uncertainty is telling them you don't know a thing about autism, right? Every individual is different, but some people don't need to throw the rules away. They need to come up with better rules that are more effective and more sustainable, but they need those rules because the brain isn't naturally offering them up the gameplay walkthrough for things like how to take a shower, how to get into a car, how to have a conversation with somebody. They need a walkthrough. The walkthrough has to be manageable, it has to be tolerable, it has to be something they can replicate. So pay attention when you're making, if something's not landing, and it's something that should work because we've got all this great evidence-based research in CBT, ask yourself if you really understand this person in their cultural context as well. So some of the other ways we can respond to thoughts. Diffusion and non-engagement responses. So diffusion, coming from acceptance and commitment therapy, this idea that you can sort of position yourself further away from the thought. Simply by saying, I'm noticing that I'm having a thought that I'm a terrible human being. Maybe singing the thought or saying it in a funny voice, right? Sort of reclaiming the negative intensity of the thought and turning it around, making it more tolerable. A way of and I think this is sort of soft reassurance, but totally allowable. Like sort of reassuring yourself that it is in fact a thought that you're dealing with and not a snarling rabid dog. Slowing the thought down, like saying the thought, very slowly. Thanking the mind for the thought. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. That's very useful right now. Appreciate that. I could be here, and the thought maybe the stove at home back in Maryland is on. Right? Thank you for that useful information in the middle of my talk. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. There's a protocol called association splitting that I think is pretty neat that came from a researcher in Germany, where you can practice associating the words of the thought with words that are kind of like it, or rhyme with it, or trigger like kind of funny reminders, but are non-threatening, right? So it's not about the content, but just about, okay, you have these words in your head, like, I should hurt myself. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pair that with, I should rent from Hertz Rental Car. And we're going to repeat that over and over and over again to the point that it gets really annoying, so that you can't have the first thought without having the second thought. And so it inhibits you from being able to take that thought seriously for very long, because we created this new neural pathway. You've split the associations. Yes, it's still scary, and yes, it's still an obsession, but it also reminds you of rental cars. It's a pretty neat thing. It does work. Non-engagement responses, right? So these are ways of talking back to the OCD without talking directly to the OCD. Going back to my metaphor about the junk mail, right? What do y'all do when you get junk mail in your email? Probably ignore it, sometimes delete it, right? But you try not to engage with it, even when you're acknowledging it, because bad things can happen. People underestimate that they can actually ignore some of their thoughts some of the time. They've been told, and they've been telling themselves that they can't, so they don't bother. But you could have any number of intrusive thoughts, and you're like, this is fine, right? Not actually respond to it. You could try it, see if it helps. None of these are going to work all the time, but if you want somebody to stop ruminating, and stop doing mental rituals, or stop doing any rituals, they might need to drive a wedge between them and the OCD. They might need to do something first to kind of create a space where they can say, okay, I'm turning away from the OCD. So mental noting, as we do in mindfulness, would be good. Like, that's the ceiling thought again. Got it, right? Then back to what I was doing before I got distracted. And then we get into kind of ERP-like territory, right? Agreeing with uncertainty. Yeah, maybe I hit someone, I don't know, whatever, I'm not a scientist. Right? Like just kind of casually letting yourself not, kind of reminding the OCD you're not going to fight with it. It's going to make sort of claims. You'll be okay, sure. And then, my personal favorite, of course, agreeing with attitude, the hold my beer of responses to OCD. Right? Like, oh, you think that's bad, right? And coming up with something even bigger, right? You really think I'm going to stab someone? I'm going to stab a lot of people today. And then again, turning away, back to what you're doing before you got distracted. ERP is encountering the triggering stimulus. Responsive mention is not doing compulsions. Trying to generate the urge to do compulsions on purpose so that we can practice resisting them, so we can have the experience of being with them. It's not necessary for the stress to go completely down in any given exposure strategy. We just kind of want it to be on its way. We don't want it to be continuing to escalate. This is what's sometimes challenging if you're working in a 45-minute model, where by the time you finally got to do the exposure and you're really into it, and you're like, oh, look at the time, and they're like in the middle of the stuff. So pace yourself. That's why longer sessions can sometimes be helpful, because you want them to be a witness to that. In habituation, we're thinking diminished effectiveness of a stimulus to elicit a response, meaning the more you engage with it, the less your brain is like, we got to do something about it. That's the traditional model, the habituation model. We repeat these things, and they're just easier to deal with. There's also the inhibitory learning model, which posits that instead of breaking down the fear and making it extinct, the brain's forming new non-threat associations. So I'm going into this situation, I'm being triggered, and I'm not doing compulsions, and I'm surviving. And so my association, like independently from whether or not it's distressing to me, is not that it's dangerous. So these new associations compete with rather than break the old associations. That's why it's important to repeat exposures and to put them in a lot of different settings. So there's like a lot of memories of different experiences. You might think of if you had a fear of being bitten by an animal because you were bit by an animal once, you're not going to get over that fear just by petting one other animal, right? You're going to have to pet many animals in many different situations. So your brain says, here's 1,000 times we weren't harmed by an animal. The brain is very quick to learn danger, which is good. That keeps us alive. It's slower to learn safety. That's good. That keeps us alive. It's really slow at learning safety after you've taught it danger, regardless of whether the danger is real or worth paying any attention to. And so you want to remind people when they're doing exposure therapy and their brain is saying, this is very bad, don't do it, that that's a good thing. That is your brain behaving completely normally to the situation. You spent upwards of a year telling it that this is dangerous, and now you're behaving like it isn't. You're going to want a brain that resists that. Because if you have a brain that doesn't resist it, you're just going to walk out in the street and not look both ways. You need that to be part of the equation. It's just that we're intentionally trying to create change here, so when you feel that distress, we're going to try to be mindful of the distress and watch it and let it be there and not let it be the reason why we stop doing this work. But it's a normal thing. It should be happening. We're trying to teach something. So, in inhibitory learning, the emphasis isn't so much on the anxiety going down, but on the anxiety being accepted or tolerated or experienced. We want to disconfirm expectations. We want there to be surprise. We want someone going in saying, this is going to be really hard, and then we want it to be hard, but maybe not quite as hard as they thought. One of my favorite therapy moments was doing knife work with a young woman who was afraid of snapping and hurting people. And so we're kind of getting ready to do the exposure, and I'm sitting there in my office, and she's sitting across from me, and she's got this big knife, and she looks at me and she says, "This is not going to end well for you." But it all worked out. We want to combine fear cues as much as we can, right? We want to get the full experience, and we want there to be variety. I don't care if you overcome your fear of the doorknob in my office. I want you to be able to touch things that other people touch, so that you can do things that other people do and not feel so isolated. A good way to think about inhibitory learning, I'm a big scary horror movie fan, and if new movies coming out, new Final Destination movies coming out soon, those movies are about OCD if you haven't noticed. I'm looking forward to it, right? I'm going to buy a ticket, I'm going to go in, and I'm not thinking, gee, I hope this is boring and relaxing. I'm like, oh, let's get this regulated, people, all right? I'm going to go in, I'm going to want that to happen. So, scary thing happens on the screen, my body goes, ah. If you catch me in that moment, did an analysis of what's happening, it's not going to look pretty, right? It's going to look like something distressing is happening. And then I'm going to turn to my friend and be like, oh, that was awful, I loved it, and eat some popcorn, right? And get right back into it. And even though my body is having a stress response, the same stress response it would have if it were in danger, there's no part of my brain that thinks, I got to get out of this movie theater. Right? So I'm inhibited from treating it like it's a threat to my life, even though I'm having all the other experiences. Roller coasters are like this too, right? They simulate near-death experiences, right? But we do it willingly, on purpose, for the thrill. And why? Well, because I've seen scary things happen on a lot of different screens. Small screens, big screens, I've seen the posters, I've read the comics, I've done all the nerd stuff, like I have so many non-threat associations that the fact that this just made my heart jump into my throat, it's fine. I can handle it, right? And we want people to be able to do that with their OCD and other things. So what are some myths about ERP? These are some of the things I've heard from people, reasons why they don't want to do it, or reasons why they don't practice it in their own work, that it's dangerous, that it's fundamentally re-traumatizing. And again, I think we do have to be thoughtful and sensitive when working with folks who have trauma-based conditions and how we approach the ERP, because we do want it to be trauma-informed, and it can be re-traumatizing if you're not paying attention to what you're doing and why you're doing it. This idea that it requires white knuckling, that you just have to kind of buckle down and get through it, no. It actually requires the opposite of that, because that's just another way of showing yourself you can't handle it. Anybody can white knuckle through pretty much anything. Can you actually be there? That it's cruel or requires people to ridicule themselves, right? Because sometimes we do overcorrections and people do things that they might not otherwise do to kind of shake themselves out of their old patterns. That it's insensitive to neurodivergence. I just think that's fundamentally false. That people with emotional dysregulation can't do ERP. This person's too anxiety sensitive or too emotionally sensitive. Well, the whole purpose of this talk, and after lunch we'll get into the DBT part of it, is that no, these people deserve to get well as well, and we just need to figure out how to help them regulate their nervous system while they do this hard work. That's incompatible with other approaches. I grew up in this industry in a frame of like, there's us evidence-based folks over here doing this, very manualized thing, and then there's all these sort of other crazy, psychoanalysts doing all this other things, right? And it's not that that's completely divorced from reality, but I think we lay it on a little bit too thick. People are complicated, and therapeutic relationships are actual relationships, right? So if it could all just be done with a workbook, we wouldn't have to get here and do these trainings and learn how to be better clinicians and supporters of our loved ones, right? So I think that my experience working in a residential environment where we're taking a holistic multi-system approach, I'll be on the same team with somebody who is coming at things from a more psychodynamic perspective, because that might actually be part of what that person needs to be able to connect the dots between where they come from and who they are and why they're having such a hard time with their OCD. I wouldn't say that's the only or primary treatment for OCD, but to completely separate it as if we're not all here trying to reduce suffering on Earth, I think does us a disservice as clinicians. But then on the flip side of that, I hate it when people say that insight-oriented therapy is bad for OCD. ERP is insight-oriented therapy, right? It's not sitting around waiting for insights to arise. It's forcing the issue. It's saying, let's get these insights going, right? But it's pushing people gently into their edge so that they can figure out what it is they're supposed to learn there and develop insight. When someone says my OCD is much improved, what they really mean is my insight is much improved, right? I know what I'm up against and I know how to deal with it. So ERP is insight-oriented treatment. And then, some people have made the claim that it doesn't factor in diversity and cultural context, but again, that's a claim about the skill level of individual providers. It doesn't say anything about ERP itself. And my Netflix recommendations are the same. Because I will sometimes use Netflix in the ERP, and it thinks I like unicorns and gay movies and hangings, and then you can it's like, maybe you'll like this. Okay, so different ways of doing ERP. In vivo, right, making direct real-time contact with this discomfort-inducing stimuli, so it might be touching something, holding a triggering object, interacting with a triggering person, looking at a triggering image, going into these environments, practicing these behaviors where these thoughts are likely to come up, right? Real time. We want to make it as much in vivo as we can, because that's where we can sort of, where the real action is at. But imaginal exposures can be very good. Sometimes you can't get at the triggering object in real life, or the triggering media in real life. Also, sometimes what you need to do is burn out the storytelling part, right? So this person is ruminating about this thing that could happen, maybe I'll go to prison, or maybe I'll hurt someone. And they're just so used to listening to themselves think, and maybe like listening to half the story. So they kind of get into the story, it gets too scary, and then they get very dysregulated. If you can actually map out the whole story, it's kind of like showing the whole monster in a scary movie, right? Once you see the whole monster, if you watch these movies, right, they just show you a little bit, like a tooth or a claw or something, and you're like, oh, it must be so scary. By the time you get to the end, it's some big, goofy animatronic thing, and you're like, okay, I guess that's scary. So having somebody actually write out the whole story about, okay, maybe this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and everybody hates me, and I'm in the news, and my legacy is ruined, and all this stuff. Okay, now we have the whole story. And so you can do exposure to that repeatedly, and essentially it gets to the place where your brain is like, all right, enough. Right? So we're trying to teach the brain what we want it to do. So imagine being able to walk the earth, see something, get triggered, notice the mind start to try to figure it out, and then have some other part of the brain be like, oh no, not the story again. No, I'm not going there. Stop it, right? Do something like without having to say anything or do anything, have the brain automatically recognize there's only so much you can read before it just becomes gobbledygook. A lot of ERP is just bringing things back to their natural state, right, through repetition. If you take a word, any word, and you repeat it enough times, it starts to lose its meaning because it was never really a word in the first place. It was just a string of sounds that you called a word. And it could be kind of weird, right? So you can practice this with, milk. What does that even mean, right? You say it over and over and over again, right? Well, it starts to fall apart into the letters, and then it falls apart into the sounds, and it just stops having its kind of wordiness because the wordiness is something we gave to it. It wasn't natural to it. So same thing with these stories. They can kind of lose their sheen. In the same way you might watch a movie over and over and over again, and it stops being scary. We do want to be careful in using ERP scripts to not encourage people to do covert rituals, and not. This isn't like, hey, let's practice ruminating, only better, right? No, it's like, let's get in front of the story, let's acknowledge that it's a story, let's acknowledge how it makes us feel, and let's keep working with it until we see something change. Sometimes people writing these scripts will sneak in rituals in the scripts. You want to pay attention to that, particularly if it's in the taboo area where people might be very self-critical. If you see somebody sort of say like, then my fears come true and it's because I'm a filthy, disgusting, terrible pig of a human being, that's probably a compulsion that they're sneaking in there, right? They're beating themselves up, right? It's not really part of the story. It's, again, just their opinion coming in to make themselves feel like they have some handle on it. pay attention to insight. I don't really do much scripting with people that I think are really struggling with insight, or who are significantly depressed, or whose only symptom seems to be moral scrupulosity. It tends to be murky territory, where someone writes a script and they get exposed to it, and they're like, yes, this really is true, right? They're like, okay, well, maybe that person's not ready, doesn't have the distance that they need yet to be able to see it as a story, so we don't want to immerse them in it just yet. And of course, pay attention to cultural context. And then we have interoceptive ERP, which is great for panic disorders, great for other things, right? We want people to feel like they're in that spot where they're compelled to do their rituals and not do them, so they can see that they can handle it. So you might work with things like temperature, or spinning someone around in a chair to make them feel dizzy, shortness of breath, feeling overheated, blushing. These are things you can do. You can generate these experiences in the body, and then notice the thought and emotion patterns come up, and then work with them in that way. All right, so timing-wise, not too bad. I think we got about 10 minutes before lunch. And so we could pause here, and if anybody has any questions, we can field them for the next few minutes before we get into DBT and the rest of it.
I was wondering if you might be willing to talk a little bit more about using cognitive diffusion with obsessions. One area that, so I like to use ACT, but one area that I sometimes get caught up in my own head is, well, what if they turn the diffusion tactic into like thought neutralizing or some other mental ritual?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just so everyone heard it, so the question is, if somebody's using diffusion to kind of reduce the sting of their automatic reactions to their intrusive thoughts, what's to keep them from relying on that in a compulsive way that just creates another problem they didn't have to begin with, right? I think you have to sort of pay attention to their description of how they're using it, because it is a kind of liability in ACT. It can come, in the same way that cognitive restructuring itself can become a liability, like relying too much on, I gotta write the thought record or else the bad thing's gonna happen. So when you think about what makes something really compulsive, one is the repetitive quality of it, right? So if someone's walking around saying, I'm having a thought that, I'm having a thought that, I'm having a thought that, right? They're doing it with the intention of reducing the thought. They're not just doing it because it reduces the thought. It's like kind of a subtle difference, but if I have a thought like, maybe I hit someone with my car, and I'm like, oh, there's that thought about maybe I hit someone with my car. That doesn't seem very compulsive. It's just me acknowledging what's going on, but it's reducing the sting a little bit by acknowledging that it's also a thought. But if I have to repeat that to myself over and over on the rest of the ride home, I'm having a thought that I hit someone with my car, right? Then that's probably more compulsive. I think the other thing you might want to pay attention to is if the person feels like they have to consistently do more of it than what they were doing before, right? So if it's growing, it's probably compulsive. I like the idea, John Grayson told this to me once, that a compulsion is only a compulsion if it's important, right? If it's not important, then it's not a compulsion. Right? You can wash your hands. You can wash your hands all day if you want to. It's fine. Right? But if you feel like you have to because it's super important, it's probably a compulsion. I like that idea. Any other questions?
So I'm curious in terms of just the insight piece. I'm thinking of one person I'm working with who sadly was just misdiagnosed. And I think there's this story I see a lot with, people going in for, he went in, really had a psychotic break because he was using, and labeled bipolar 1 right away. Because now that's his trajectory. And so through just like a lot of time, we were able to get him reevaluated, and it made sense because I was like, this isn't right, like the meds are not working. So there's something not making sense. And he just was reevaluated, just got a new provider, diagnosed with OCD and ADHD. And the thing that I'm noticing, and I'm curious if this is just like the moving slow and just doing a lot more than noticing, his OCD really manifests around this belief of being a terrible person because of his past, and that he is highly creative and it's so fixed and delusional, which I think created this misconception that I was psychotic in bipolar. So when it comes to the insight, right, he'll tell me I can feel like there's a part that wants to believe it's not true, but that he feels so deeply it's true. And so when it comes to that piece of like creating the distance, yeah, can you just speak to like how with someone who I think part of his complex trauma is just being so misunderstood his whole life. And we call it, I kind of help, I was trying to do the distancing technique. I do EMDR and I'm EMDR trained, and his nervous system was like, no.
Yeah.
So I tried to give him a name of like, it's a nightmare. Like, this is a nightmare. And I tried to share with him like, it's a nightmare and I'm not scared of it. You're scared of this. That's okay right now. But like when it comes to that, like, yeah, you just really kind of front load a lot more of the mindfulness slowly.
Well, so to have insight is really another way of saying to see things the way they really are. Right? Like, most people with OCD actually have pretty high insight, which is what they're so upset about. Right? I know I would never do this in a million years. I know it's my OCD. Why is that not enough? Right? The individual you're speaking of sounds like comes by it honestly. It's this experience of chronic invalidation and complex trauma. And if it started pretty young, the smartest thing to do would be conclude that you're the problem. Right? When people who are supposed to take care of you hurt you, or when things that are supposed to be safe end up being dangerous, and you're a kid, it doesn't make sense that you would be thinking, yeah, well, we live in an unjust world, right? Or maybe my parents aren't these godlike characters. Like, no, this is part of natural development. So the easiest explanation is I am bad. And then if it happens young enough, your brain literally develops around that idea. It's affected at the neurological level by growing up with that idea of I am bad. So we can't just talk people out of it, unfortunately, right? So I think aligning with them, I'm like, I kind of see how you got there. I don't agree with you, but I kind of see how you got there. And as it turns out, the best tools we know for increasing insight are mindfulness and self-compassion. And I don't like self-compassion, but I think there's a way we can do it that's objective, that's not so fluffy and kind, and is really just about like, what do you have control over, what's real, what's the difference between I should have known better and my old stories, and what I actually need right now in this moment. And to get that person to really start practicing effective regulation skills in the moment and realizing, hey, every once in a while I can show up for myself and feel good about it. I didn't know that, right? That's new information, and you build on that. But it can take a long time, particularly if they're doing other things that are reinforcing their self-loathing, like self-harm, right? So you have to pay attention to that. I also think people can develop insight into how little insight they have, right? So the word delusional sounds very scary, but it just means you have a very strong fixed belief that no one else agrees with you on. It's all right. I'm sure I have some delusions, but they don't impair my functioning. So this one's impairing your functioning. Can you acknowledge? Can you get this person to say without self-blame and punishment, like, oh yeah, I think that's one of those delusional thoughts they keep telling me I have. You see this in BDD, for example, commonly. I'm working with an individual right now where she's so funny. She's like, oh yeah, all this BDD workbook, paperwork stuff you showed me, like I have all these symptoms. It's a shame I'm just ugly though. Like there's this complete disconnect. And being able to say like, oh, this makes sense for other people who are like me but not ugly. I'm like me but I am ugly. Like it's delusional. And so what we're working on is just being able to acknowledge like, you can't get away from that focus right now. It's okay. I'll be here when you're ready. But let's at least acknowledge that you can't seem to get two people together to agree with you on this subject. There's probably a reason for that.
Jon, I'm curious how you'd respond to working with somebody who has sort of moral, religious scrupulosity type thing when some of the compulsion is based loosely in religion, but it becomes almost their own rule that feels egocentric to them. So an example, I can think of is, let's say a client whose religious background tells them that books are sacred because they hold knowledge, ergo books should be handled respectfully. But then their rules for how respectful you have to be to a book, like you have to put it down extremely gently, turn the pages extremely slowly, might make homework take an incredibly long amount of time to do. And a client who could acknowledge, no one else in my family does it this way. Our religious scholars tell me I don't have to do it this way. But this is of the spiritual realm, so emotional reasoning enters the equation, right? It feels like I should do it this way, and feelings come from my spirit, which is my connection with God. And so it's really easy to get bogged down into a conversation about that goes nowhere. So I'm curious as to if you've had situations like this and how might you respond to it?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I definitely would want to make sure I knew as much as I could about like who this person really is in the context of the religion. I'd want to study a little bit about the religion and see kind of how far removed from reality he really is. Many religions have the idea of sacred books. And, you don't want to be sipping a coffee and smoking a cigarette while juggling a Torah. Like, I get it. But does this apply to like all books that have any religious words in them, right?
Right, and that would be the thing. Some of these clients extend the rules and will acknowledge, I don't hold anyone else to these standards. My family members, my religious community don't do this, but I feel like I have to do it, right? So I feel it, therefore it must be true.
Yeah, so I would ask a few questions. One is if it's working out, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if he's happy that way, I mean, who are we to stop him from being slow? If everybody finds it annoying, but he doesn't mind that, he's welcome to show up in the world that way. If he's unhappy that way, you have to challenge him on like, what does he want from you, right? Why is he telling you I'm having a problem and then telling you that it's not solvable? He's supposed to collaborate with you on a solution to the problem, not just complain about it. There's probably an element of narcissism, right? Like I know a little bit more than everybody else in my religion about how this should be done, and he's maybe a little embarrassed to acknowledge that, so he's framing it as, I'm compelled by the Spirit. No, he thinks he knows more than other people. There's probably more to it. And I guess, I don't know this individual at all, but it might also be symptomatic of an over-controlled personality type.
Yeah.
Not necessarily OCPD, but this sense of if I have a rule and I've done it for a long time, I shouldn't be expected to get off that track and get onto another track.
Right.
So one approach that could be helpful, which we won't have time for today, but I think is very interesting, is to radically open DBT and kind of looking at how this person can both accept themselves as an over-controlled type and see the value in increasing flexibility.
Thank you.
All right, shall we eat? Dr. Diamond, do you want to make a...
Sure.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you so much. I made mine.